Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? Autism. It's been in the spotlight ever since President Trump picked Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be the nation's health chief. Secretary Kennedy has said that he is on a mission to find the root causes of autism, saying he will deliver an answer soon. His critics say it's all a front to erode trust for vaccines. Secretary Kennedy has for years stated that there is a link between vaccines and autism, despite decades of research showing that there is not. Now, there's plenty of mistrust and suspicion to go around. Vaccine skeptics questioning settled science because of who is saying it's settled, and the scientific establishment resisting a new investigation because of who is behind it. But where does that leave the millions of families living with the reality of autism? We speak with a MAHA mom about her journey with her son's autism, and we welcome Alison Singer, co-founder and president of the Autism Science Foundation, and mother of a daughter living with autism, on where we are heading. Let's get started. Welcome back.
Welcome.
Nice to see everyone. We have a good show for everyone today. We're going to be talking about autism. Actually, before we get started, I have to just bring one thing up. After our last episode with Jake Tapper, we got a few notes from people saying that Brenda curses too much.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to address that. Listen, guys, I am sorry if y'all think I curse too much. I do curse too much. My mom says I curse too much. But the truth is, like, it's who I am. It's who.
Yeah, to prove people are listening. I mean, that's good.
People are listening. I don't want to like, you know what I'm saying? Like, piss off any of our listeners.
There you go, Brenda.
Just don't get us into a 5-second delay problem, Brenda.
I think you got wrapped up in like, we're back in the newsroom with Jake.
Right.
It was like that kind of.
There's a lot of cursing in
mode.
newsrooms, I'll tell you that. But listen, this is who I am. I am who I am. So, but I'll try to tone it down. Okay, I'll try to tone it down. We should probably tell you who we are. I'm Brenda Adhikari.
And I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Dr. Maggie Bartlett.
I'm Dr. Mark.
Maggie's a virologist, Mark's a doctor and a medical reporter, and Brenda and I are, of course, are journalists.
Yes. So look, like we've been saying, we have been thinking about this episode really since the start of the show. Autism, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., public health. These are rather combustible topics these days. We want to do everything we can to kind of stay above that fray as much as we can in order to explore this and see what the conversation and where it's at right now. But before we do that, I want to bring in a friend of our show. As we said earlier, we are going to be speaking with a Make America Healthy Again mom. Nancy Fuller is going to be riding shotgun with us today. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Brenda. Happy to be here.
It's so good to see you again. Nancy was part of those MAHA public health conversations. She is the mother of an adult son living with autism. She lives in Ohio. She's part of that state's Make America Healthy Again movement. She worked for Ohio for Kennedy. And Nancy, just briefly remind our audience of how autism has impacted your family.
Well, it was pretty radical change to our family. We weren't given a lot back then. This is 30 years ago from diagnosis. We weren't given a lot of instruction. And back then, they didn't really know much at all. And they said to prepare for no language, no love, no laughter. It was a very dismal diagnosis given. And I tend to be a very upbeat person, and I immediately discounted that. And I just said, they're wrong. They obviously don't know this young man, and we're going to prove them differently. So despite the negativity on the onset, I think we've been trying to take the high road every step of the way. But I would tell you, as I've mentioned before, it's a challenge that parents cannot even approach understanding until you've been there.
Wow.
And I know there's all kinds of degrees on the spectrum. I know people that are high functioning that are doing fine, or it seem to be doing fine. So it's not really talking about them. But my son is probably, we don't go back for re-diagnoses, but if Dr. Nancy were to say something, I would probably say he'd probably be categorized as moderate. And I think moderate to severe is just changes everything in life from how you approach going out of your house and when you go and when you can't go because of moods and swings and seizures and things, to, how do you go on vacation? Or where does he go to find purpose in life? And in my retirement, I'm working toward helping him live a more purposeful life.
Boy, Nancy, I'm always so moved when I hear you speak about your son. And I know that part of your questions about the root causes of autism led you towards Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the fact that he also said he wanted to find those root causes. Obviously, there is much disagreement about what he's looking into. But with that, I wanted to, just hang with us for a little bit. You're going to be riding shotgun. We're going to welcome Alison in a little bit. Today, we're getting into what we know, what we don't know, what we still have to learn about autism. And I'm sure we'll have questions, Nancy, along the way. But first, Tom, why don't we walk through where we've been and where we are when it comes to understanding what causes autism?
Yeah. And we sort of picked a date back in 1948. It was April 26th, and Time magazine ran a piece titled Medicine, Frosted Children. And it described a doctor named Leo Kanner and his work with a very small group of kids. These kids were withdrawn, they were socially isolated, and Dr. Kanner observed them and came up with a name for what he was seeing. He called it early infantile autism. And it was really the first time we heard the word autism, which quickly moved to the question, and a question we're going to tackle today, which is what was causing this? And Dr. Kanner put forward a theory. He said it was not something that was occurring within the child, but the cause was actually lay in the way the child was being raised. When Kanner observed these children's parents, he says he saw cold, loveless, non-empathetic moms and dads. And he believed that was at the root of this newly diagnosed condition.
Wow.
In fact,
Cold, loveless.
In fact, in a paper.
Can I just say, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely.
I praise God every day that my son wasn't diagnosed during those times.
Yes.
Because that is just unfathomable to even hear that.
It sure is.
Yeah, he wrote in a paper that infantile autism was caused by, quote, a genuine lack of maternal warmth. And he went on to say that it's as if these children were being kept neatly in a refrigerator that didn't defrost.
I got to hold myself back from just jumping through the screen right now. I know y'all don't want me to curse, but this warrants, that is fucked up.
Yeah. So, so within a couple of years, a researcher named Bruno Bettelheim came along, and he ran with this theory, and basically said it was the parents, specifically the moms, that were causing autism. And that's when this new phrase entered our lexicon: refrigerator moms, cold, unfeeling moms. And when they raised a child, this was contributing to this condition called autism.
Yeah, Tom, I mean, we're coming off the heels of when we thought autism may have even been related to schizophrenia. These were different times. And Nancy, like you said, it's really hard to put yourself in that environment and then being told that and then having to figure out how to move forward. But guess what? That theory did stick, and it stuck for decades. In the 1960s, we began to see a shift, and another researcher got involved. His name was Bernard Rimland. He was a psychologist and the father of an autistic child. I don't know if it was moderate, profound, who knows, but that child later went on to become an artist. So Bernard Rimland, he dove into what the scientific literature existed at the time, and he really was unsatisfied with that explanation that it was the parents doing this. So he went to work. He wrote a book. It was a seminal book. It was called Infantile Autism. It came out in 1964. And in short, he basically said there was a biological basis behind autism. It wasn't about parenting. So he threw a wrench into this. And researchers were seeing a much bigger prevalence among boys versus girls. And so that also, if it was parenting, it didn't really add up, that boys were becoming more diagnosed with this. And also there were families where one sibling was autistic and the other one wasn't. So the parents are the cause theory was beginning to fall apart. And needless to say, that was a huge relief, like you said, Nancy, for those parents, because after years of being blamed, they were finally hearing something that gave them hope. And more importantly, they were hearing that their child's autism wasn't their fault. Rimland included, he had a book, like we mentioned, and the back of the book was a checklist of typical symptoms of autism. And it was called E-1. because that was the page number. And it became well known among parents who essentially ripped that page out of the book to fill out a checklist. Everybody was frantic. Does my child have autism? And, looking back, that the fact that the parents were tearing out a checklist of a book, it says so much. It was the kind of spark for a grassroots movement that's still burning strong until this day. Rimland saw autism as a developmental disorder that begins in childhood, where a child struggles with communication and social interaction. We've all seen and heard about the repetitive behaviors that some people with autism have. He believed it was neurological and theorized that genetics play a role. So, by the way, Rimland, would eventually hold a meeting in 1965 in Teaneck, New Jersey, between parents of children with autism, and that meeting would lay the foundation for the Autism Society of America. So this really was a shift and the birth of this partnership between parents and advocacy and doctors and experts. We should note that he also evolved, right? Everything evolves in the world, especially in autism right now. And he was an early adopter of the theory that thimerosal in vaccines might contribute to autism. And, that's been proven wrong, but he did shift a little bit.
Yeah. And then if we just scoot forward to 1977, and that was a seminal year, the lid was really blown off of our understanding, or the beginnings of our understanding of what this, biological background of what is causing autism. There was a study published involving twins. And the researchers found that identical twins, so these are twins that share virtually all of their DNA, had a much higher chance of both being autistic as compared to fraternal twins who share no more DNA than regular siblings. So in one fell swoop, you really had this dying refrigerator mom theory collapse. It's now completely pushed to the side. And this new question began to animate research, which is, how much was genetics playing a role in the cause of autism?
Yeah, Tom, I think it's so fascinating that this is when we had a lot more technology coming into the space. In the 1990s, there was this huge explosion of genetic research where we got the human genome mapped, and there was this focus on DNA and its role in a lot of different diseases. And we've made a ton of progress. And today we know that there's a strong genetic component to autism. But what are the genes that are involved? How are these genes influenced by environmental factors? There's still a lot of research that needs to be done. And Mark, I know you looked into this.
Yeah, brace yourself for some numbers here, and a real testament to the magnificent progress. Scientists have now identified over 800 genes somehow linked to autism spectrum disorder. That alone is an incredible scientific achievement, looking for a quote unquote root cause. But keep in mind, when you have that many genetic factors at play, it also makes it harder, because then it's harder to pinpoint, that single root cause that's truly actionable. We all, hope that it's, able to be buttoned up nicely. Here's a cause. We've discovered it. Now let's do something about it. And it's just not the kind of disorder that allows for that. I mean, Nancy, if you think about the complexity of your son and how you evolved and how your doctors, introduced the diagnosis to you and how that's different now, it just is not able to be put into a box. But thanks to advances in genetic testing, doctors can now identify a specific cause of autism in about 40% of patients. There's numbers around 20, 30, but it's as high as 40% of patients. But that's only if you go through a full genetic workup. And that is looking for chromosomes, it's looking for syndromes, it's looking for metabolic issues. And
Wait, Mark, can I ask you something? I hate to interrupt, but so for anyone who's been pregnant, I have been pregnant twice. You get a test, right? You get all kinds of tests to see whether you are carrying some sort of a genetic marker for some sort of a condition, right? Is that what you mean by a genetic workup, or is this something else that is? Let's just be honest. Is it more expensive? Is it something that people have access to?
No. So what you're talking about is prenatal or, genetic testing for known genetic defects, things like trisomy 21, Down syndrome, these common genetic mutations that sometimes need to be discovered so that you could have a healthier pregnancy, or also so you're prepared when the child is delivered. Those are different. So that's like Down syndrome and things like that. these are genetic tests that you wouldn't necessarily be offered unless you have a reason to be offered. So, for example, like the American Academy of Pediatrics now says that the time to check for autism is somewhere between 18 and 24 months with like a screening tool. And then if you get that diagnosis or you're suspicious that the child has autism, then you open up the envelope and, to see if there's a genetic test that could be figured out as a cause. So it's not for everybody. It's not a screening tool for everybody. It's for the right population. It's for if a child, might need that. But, so that if you do end up going through all that testing, you could have a single mutation in the way that, that impacts, for example, the way a brain's development is, being impacted. Or, it might not be like a single genetic disease. It could be many small genetic differences, a gene over here, a gene over there. But one important thing to keep in mind is how hard, like Brenda, you just said, how hard is it to get that genetic test, to get that, full genetic workup? One study found that only 30% of autism patients were getting full genetic testing. Some societies say it's about only, half of the people are getting genetic testing. So even with genetic testing available, not everybody has access to that. And that is another problem, because if you don't know the gene that you might have that's causing your child to have autism, you could be missing out on something. So, but even if you put all that together, like let's say, the genetic testing, there's still about 60 to 70% of the time we just don't understand the cause. And let's just take a beat for that for a second, because that's incredibly frustrating. So for a mom to go through or dad to go through, this whole workup and it comes up empty, and now they have to go into the world without having, some information they feel they can do something about, like a to-do list or a checklist. So then we start talking about, well, then what is it? If it's not the gene, what is it? And then it opens up this whole idea that we've talking about, environmental factors. What are those? There's a huge range of those. There's something as simple as a parent's age. Autism has been associated with older parents, or, for example, mom's greater than 40, dad's greater than 50. There are things that may have happened in pregnancy, like the baby being born premature or low birth weight, or were they exposed to something, alcohol, tobacco. Those are common things, but maybe it's something we don't know that the mom was exposed to. Was the mother diabetic or malnourished or taking medications? We've heard everything, everything from heavy metal pollution or air pollution. Was it just stress? I mean, you think about it, there's all this stuff out there. And at the end of the day, you can think about it in two ways. There are inside factors, which is basically your genes, and then outside factors, everything else. So what's in our food? What's in our water? Is it pesticides? So, Nancy, hearing us talk about all this, and you've lived this. Have you, have doctors been able to identify something in your son's DNA that helps explain his autism? Did you ever have a test or anything like that?
My recollection, Mark, is when he was first diagnosed, they did the very basic screen on genetics for Fragile X and a couple things specific that they were looking for that were ruled out, but it was never recommended in my world to get full genetic testing done.
Yeah. What year is this? What year is this?
He was born in 92.
Yeah. So it was maybe
end of
before.
92. So, but he was diagnosed in 95.
So, that may have been just, a little too soon for all these, genetic diseases and genetic defects to be discovered.
One more factor beyond genetics, beyond air pollution and the age of parents, toxins. You guys know I'm going to talk about this. One of the things we're researching is the impact of viruses that a mother may acquire while pregnant. And there's a lot of attention being paid to these in utero viral infections because they impact the mother's immune response. And the viruses that are contracted during this period of time are linked to an increase in autism. There's a number of viruses that have been associated with an increased risk of autism. And it's another really worthwhile path of research to take, and one that we really need to spend a lot more time understanding the long-term outcomes of these acute infections.
Let's talk about prevalence. Earlier this month, the CDC came out with its latest assessment of the prevalence of autism in America, and they looked at 8-year-olds. And the new study found that there has been a rise in autism from 1 in 150 kids in the year 2000 to 1 in 31 kids in 2022, which is the most recent data. So that's a stunning jump. 1 in 31 American kids is on the autism spectrum today. But here's the thing, the researchers who wrote the study said much of this rise has to do with better screening and more proactive diagnosis. So just kind of hold that thought. They're saying better screening, more proactive diagnosis, a big part of this explanation of this rise.
Yeah, we hear this a lot. I mean, this is kind of what the birth of this movement is like. What are we doing? What is happening? How did this happen on our watch? And one of the things, we mentioned it briefly, but in 2007, the American Academy of Pediatrics, started recommending that all children be screened for autism at 18 and 24 months because some of the findings are subtle. So here we are. Essentially, every pediatric practice across the country is doing this. That's going to simply just run up the numbers because you're going to find people. Then you have all of this amazing science that's happening. We talked about the genes, but we're also talking about new ways to diagnose, and that's advancing. For example, there was a 2023 study, I loved it, in JAMA, and they used eye tracking to spot early signs of autism in toddlers as young as 16 months of age. That eye tracking method was really good at picking up cases early. And it matched, it was right. It matched expert diagnoses about 8 out of 10 times. And that's a kind of breakthrough in diagnosis that helps explain why we keep seeing the autism rate going up. And we're getting better at finding it, and we're doing it earlier.
Yeah. And then also, as we've been sort of touching on, it's simply, what is the definition of autism? So in 2013, autism was turned into autism spectrum disorder, which is a wider umbrella of conditions. And suddenly, for example, those with Asperger's were brought under this new expanded definition. We've seen,
and Tom,
also,
that's in the that's in the DSM-4, and it's basically the Bible of how you diagnose all of these types of conditions. So we essentially rewrote the rules in 2013.
Right. Sort of parallel track. There's been a rise in government funding for interventions. So that's sort of helped push families, schools, communities, doctors to make diagnoses, to take advantage of those interventions, especially early interventions. And finally, mercifully, the stigma has faded, and that has propelled more and more families to go out and get that diagnosis for their child.
So here we are in 2025, and now you have some new kids on the block. You have Secretary Kennedy, and he has a new big push to find out once and for all what's causing autism. He has reframed this discussion, and he has captured a lot of people in it. He basically says there are two assertions. The first is, like Tom just mentioned, we have way too much autism. The number of cases is staggering, and it's skyrocketing. And he says it is not about how we diagnose it. There has to be something else. So he says we need to move away from this idea that it's just being talked about because we're finding it earlier. And he says, quote, the simply artifacts of better diagnosis, better recognition, or changing diagnostic criteria. He says we need to move away from that. He simply doesn't believe that it's just changing diagnostic criteria. Then here is where we're really changing the direction and the trajectory. He says the culprit behind what's causing autism is an environmental issue and not genetic. He says, quote, this is a preventable disease. He said that last month when announcing the new numbers. We know that it's an environmental exposure. It has to be. Genes do not cause epidemics. So then he described this new autism research initiative as a series of new studies to identify precisely what the environmental toxins are that are causing it. He thinks that we just haven't turned enough stones to find that out. Then he has this MAHA report that came out last week. And then, one of the things that we saw in that report, which was interesting to me, that they really just landed on one thing. Preliminary evidence suggests a possible association between the consumption of food colorings and autism, although further long-term research is necessary to establish a definitive link. And that's not the only thing he mentions, but it is interesting that it's a key, section, and it says specifically linking to food dyes.
Yeah, RFK is obviously a real disruptor. In trying to understand where he's coming from on this issue, he was in front of Congress recently, and he said, I don't think we should be funding that genetic work anymore. What we really need to do now is identify the environmental toxins. So picking up on what Mark said, he is trying to really focus on environmental triggers.
Elephant in the room, the issue of vaccines. In the announcement of this investigation, a lot of people were listening to see if RFK Jr. would mention vaccines. He did not. but they happen to fall under this environmental category. And there's broad scientific consensus after many, many studies that vaccines do not cause autism. It is, of course, a theory that we've heard RFK Jr. promote in the past very vehemently. And so it's been a huge concern of what this investigation is really going to look at. And Tom, you had looked a little bit more into
and
this.
I'd say concern or an opportunity, depending on your perspective on vaccines and autism. But so what exactly is RFK's new investigation into autism spectrum disorder? And RFK says they're working on creating a database. They describe it as a real world platform that would let researchers sift and sort through patient data, things like insurance claims and electronic medical records, using records from Medicare and Medicaid to chase down causes. Of course, the use of this term autism registry caused a lot of confusion and fear among some parents who were worried that their child could be identified in a database. Perhaps that could lead to discrimination in the future. HHS heard that. They've retired the term registry, and they promised that privacy is going to be respected.
It's so interesting, Nancy. I was kind of looking at the expressions on your face, too, to sort of see how you were absorbing some of this information. And I'm sure it's got to be, really frustrating as a parent to hear from doctors say, well, the reason there's more autism cases is because there's better diagnosis. And that's, and it's not that may be untrue, but I wonder how that lands with you, Nancy.
I believe it's true that we're doing everything Mark and Tom said, we're doing a much better job of identifying. But I think it is also more than that. And there are stones that have not been turned over, in my opinion. And it's a big controversial topic, but, Maggie referenced that all the studies have been done correlating and ruling out there's any connection. And I take challenge with a lot of that because to my knowledge, and I am not the expert in the room on all of this science, but to my knowledge, most of the correlation studies were done on the MMR and on thimerosal. And to my knowledge, there's probably 14 other vaccines, not to mention like 20 other ingredients that have not been studied. So to me to say emphatically, yeah, all the studies, it's all done, science settled, no correlation to vaccines, it doesn't sit right with me.
It's a really unsatisfying answer for you.
Yeah.
It's an unsatisfying answer for me, and that's just one of the multiple things that are not satisfying me.
I think this is a good opportunity to actually bring Alison into the conversation because she is the co-founder and president of the Autism Science Foundation, and they've been working on this for a long time. And so when we come back, we're going to be joined by Alison Singer. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We are thrilled to welcome someone with just a deep experience and also has just a personal connection to this. I'd like to welcome Alison Singer, Harvard Business School. She left a job at NBC to be the first CEO of Autism Speaks before heading out to found Autism Science Foundation in 2009, which funds autism research. She has served in public roles, helping to write the annual strategic plan for how federal dollars are spent on autism research. She serves on a ton of boards for some incredible institutions focused on autism, including the University of North Carolina's Autism Research Center, and is part of the external advisory board for the CDC Center for Developmental Disabilities. I'm like losing my breath talking about this. And she's the mother of an adult autistic child and sister and legal guardian of her older brother, who's also autistic. Alison Singer, it is truly an honor to welcome you to Why Should I Trust You?
Thanks for having me.
And of course, we are thrilled that you and Nancy Fuller are on this show with us. Look, talk to us a little bit about your own mom, who was she blamed as being a quote unquote refrigerator mom in the late 60s and early 70s when your brother was diagnosed with autism?
Unfortunately, she absolutely was. My brother was diagnosed in 1969, and at that point, the strong belief was that autism was the mother's fault. In fact, my mother was told that the reason my brother was autistic was because her first thought when she saw him after waking up from anesthesia is that he looked like a scrawny yellow chicken. So apparently, that singular thought in her mind, which she didn't say out loud, was enough to send my brother into a world of autism. And she was told that the best thing she could do for my brother would be to send him away to this particular school in Chicago and to try harder with her other children. Now, anyone who knows my mom knows that that is not going to happen. She found probably the one study of autism that was taking place in New York City at the time, and that was at Bellevue Hospital, being done by Dr. Magda Campbell. And in order to participate in that study, my brother actually had to live as an inpatient at Bellevue. So he did that for 2 years. And during that time, as part of the study, my mother actually had to undergo Freudian psychoanalysis because think about it, they thought autism is caused by the moms. So to learn about the causes of autism, they actually studied the moms. So, she's
I'm
sort
just
of
so mad when I'm hearing this. I can't.
really humiliating.
Yeah, I can't even imagine just being told those things and that guilt that you're put through. Alison, you have a daughter, Jody. Tell us a little bit about Jody and what the journey has been like for you once she got her autism diagnosis.
So Jody had problems from birth, really. She didn't want to eat, she didn't want to sleep, she cried constantly. She was diagnosed with early colic, late colic. I've never seen colic quite like this. Failure to thrive, everything under the sun. And she continued to show what I now know are early signs of autism. But at the time, even having a brother with autism, I didn't see the signs because people with autism are all so different. I do remember asking my mom, did Stephen look like this? Did he behave like this? And I was very relieved when my mother said, no, Stephen never did things like this. So I said, okay, well, at least it's not autism. But of course, everyone's autism manifests differently. She really never showed interest in other children, except maybe her sister later on. She played with toys in very unusual ways. She would line them up by size. She would sort them by color. Really, I know we like to talk about imaginative play, but really children should play with toys in the way the manufacturer intended them to be played with. And she continued to show signs. She didn't really, she had a handful of words, but she didn't use them to communicate. She only repeated words and phrases that she heard in books that I read to her. She loved to be read to, and so I spent hours and hours reading to her. And that continues today to be her source of language. She has what's described as delayed echolalia. She will use phrases that she heard in books or in videos and try to use them with communicative intent. So if she wanted to go outside, for example, she would recite a line maybe from Madeline. Outside are birds and trees and sky, and so 10 days pass quickly by. And that would mean she wanted to go outside. But if I would ask her, do you want grape juice? She couldn't say yes or no. So she didn't, she had some speech. She didn't have any useful, pragmatic language. Now she's diagnosed with profound autism. She had a ton of ABA therapy. She had other types of therapy. We tried every possible intervention. She was probably in 6 or 7 schools by the time we decided she needed to be in a residential center. But now she is thriving. She lives and works at the Center for Discovery, which is it's an intentional community for people with autism and other types of disabilities in the Catskills in New York. And there she is raising animals. She has always loved animals from the time she was a little girl. So the farming community really suits her.
I know we're going to move to research in a moment, but I just thought we'd hang a little bit on this idea of the refrigerator mom. And you both, Nancy, you and Alison, you raised children when that theory had died. Thank goodness. But I'm wondering about the legacy of that, and about this feeling of guilt, especially for mothers. And Alison, I guess I'll go to you first. I mean, did you, even though that theory was wrong, it was discredited, was there still this feeling of guilt that somehow you were responsible for this? I mean, just talk about those feelings?
Of course. I mean, I think every mother who has a child with an illness or a disability wonders what they might have done to cause it, even if that thought is not rational. I thought about, okay, I traveled while I was pregnant. Maybe I was walking through the metal detector, or maybe I ate too much tuna fish. Of course you worry. What did I do? I think every parent feels that.
Nancy, if you take us back in time, did you feel that when you were receiving this diagnosis?
Yes, I did. Just like Allison said, it's hard not when you're cultivating this body inside of you for 9 months and then they come out. And in her case, it was immediate. In mine, it was delayed. But nonetheless, I went back to my pregnancy and pre-pregnancy, and doctors even, I remember asking me so many questions. So many. Did you do this? Did you eat that? Did you?
Yeah.
And for the most part, I didn't. But it planted in my head that I could be the culprit, even though they never announced that, oh, well, it must have been because you did such and such. So there was never something that it pointed to other than kind of suspicion.
I think what you guys are both talking about and is this incredible intuition that moms have, and moms asking all of these hard questions, and I guess refusing to be dismissed. And then I think as it's played out, like, science has caught up to what you were already feeling. I think especially Allison, given what you know about research and everything, now that we've seen the power of that advocacy, and especially now where the advocacy is really strong, how do we harness that for good? How do we push future research and services and, I guess just understanding into the, next phase?
Well, I think parents can do one of two things. They can take their hurt and they can take their anger and they can withdraw, or they can take those feelings and they can channel them into advocacy. And if you look at everything that has been accomplished in the autism world, it has been under the direction of parents. It was parents who founded the first advocacy groups, the National Alliance for Autism Research, the Cure Autism Now in California, Autism Speaks. Those were all founded by parents. And the first thing they did was they lobbied for federal funding for autism research. So the first federal law in 2006, called the Combating Autism Act, was the first time that we had a law on the books that required the NIH to devote a specific amount of funding each year to autism research. Similarly, parents were the ones who opened schools because they recognized that there were not enough special education programs or special schools to meet their children's needs. And now it's parents who are starting businesses for the purpose of employing people with autism and also opening intentional communities and residences. So the power of advocacy is what has gotten us where we are today.
I mean, that was under, I guess 2006 was under George Bush, who passed that. And essentially since then, there's been billions of dollars that science has put and dedicated for autism at the NIH, the CDC, and, other agencies. Have we made the progress that we need to make in terms of what we're talking about today mostly, which would be the cause? Like, where did all of that get us in terms of figuring out the cause of autism?
So when I look back, where we were 20 years ago when we first passed the Combating Autism Act to where we are now, just last December of 2024, we reauthorized the bill. Now it's referred to as the Autism Cares Act. It's very tempting to say we really haven't made that much progress, or to wonder, have we made enough scientific progress to actually affect someone's life at the point of care? What we've learned is that science is slow, right? It's painfully slow as a parent. I think we want answers yesterday, but I think what we are seeing is that we are making progress in terms of finding what does cause autism. So at the International Society for Autism Research meeting just last month in Seattle, we saw for the first time really evidence of biological and genetic differences in autism subtypes, including profound autism. So we saw like multiple biological models that confirmed the types of subtypes that we had back in DSM-4 before we moved to DSM-5 and collapsed everyone under the umbrella autism spectrum disorder. So we saw genetically defined subtypes, we saw imaging-based subtypes, we saw eye tracking-based subtypes, language-derived subtypes, we saw subtyping based on organoid size. And what these studies show was that there were 2, and in some cases 3, biological subtypes. And as I said, this sort of harkens back to when we were under DSM-4 and we had classic autism, PDD-NOS, and Asperger's syndrome. But I think it's really important for us to try and focus on the fact that we are making important advances. For the first time, really, at INSAR this year, we weren't talking about could we make corrections to the genetic abnormalities that are causing autism, but really, how would we make those changes? So, like I said, the questions are not sort of if or how, but really when. So, for example, how do we deliver therapeutics to the brain to correct genetic abnormalities? When is the best time to intervene? Like, this is a type of science that just 5 years ago sounded like science fiction, right? And we're actually seeing children's genetic anomalies remedied now via CRISPR-based gene editing. We saw that story that was all over the news.
It was amazing.
And our children who have the monogenic forms of autism won't be far behind. So I'd say from a purely scientific standpoint, I'm definitely more hopeful now than I have been in years. But I think we have to really re-galvanize our sense of urgency so that the scientific advancements that we are making in terms of re-regulating proteins associated with genetic disorders, actually intervening in RNA. We have to make sure that these advancements over the last few years are not squandered. And unfortunately, they're coming at a time when NIH is cutting scientific funding across the board, including for autism, which I think we had hoped might be spared based on RFK's focus on autism. But it hasn't been spared. Our scientists in the autism world are experiencing dramatic cuts in funding.
So, Alison, I think that is a nice way to transition into the next part of this conversation. You had talked about galvanizing urgency. I think it's clear that you think quite differently from Secretary Kennedy about a lot of things. You've said very strongly, and we're going to get into this, about the vaccine link to autism. You say that there's none, and that is what the scientific consensus is on this topic. I just want to know if this is true, that you had said that you applauded his desire to look for the root causes of autism and make that a priority. Tell us a little bit about that.
100%. I give RFK tremendous credit and the entire administration for wanting to study the causes of autism. I mean, for as long as I've been doing this work, 25 years, we have been so eager for our president and the administration to recognize the tragedy of profound autism and to speak about autism and to want to focus on understanding the causes. Because, I mean, frankly, for the last 4 years, autism was really romanticized at the federal level. And the federally funded autism research agenda, which so many parents fought so hard for, the studies moved away from causation and from treatment. And they were focusing instead on sort of characterizing the experiences of high-functioning people with autism. And people with profound autism, which the CDC has measured, and is 26% of people with autism, so at least a quarter, they were left behind for the past 4 years. And so I think many of us in the profound autism community were very hopeful about the opportunity to refocus research on underlying biology and on developing medically based interventions.
Alison, I want to get to something that, even just on our short little conversation about autism, we've already hit a couple things and we're kind of at like impasse. Like we've talked about, that the evidence doesn't support that anything about vaccines causes autism. We've said it, it's been shown. Nancy talks about her feelings on this. And she says, most of that work has been done on, the MMR vaccine. Or maybe it's on thimerosal. And right here in this moment is this huge doubt, right? Did we really cover it all? And I think it does speak to the power of doubt. And, did we really exhaust it? Like, we studied it for MMR. I think we studied it with, the DTP vaccine, the diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccine. We studied it with aluminum, formaldehyde. We looked at the schedule. But there's still just this unsatisfactory answer for some people, that there's still something left that we haven't looked at with vaccines. And Nancy, I mean, does that summarize like what your feelings are on this? Because I really want to make sure we get this point and talk about it.
Yeah, I think that is one point. The other point that I just need clarity in general on, the pre-licensing trials of all the childhood vaccines, as I understand it, were done with placebo-controlled trials. But what I've learned is that if part of the ingredients, preservatives, everything else inside the vaccine are potential threats, then the placebo in all these trials needs to be inert, inactive, like a saline. Mm-hmm. And from what I understand in my sources, the trials that were done were not against a saline solution placebo. And therefore, it gets back to suspicion and concern that, well, wait a minute, if there's aluminum in the placebo, for example, then you're not really ruling out aluminum possibly being part of the issue here. So that's another piece to the whole equation. One is, were the studies done on all the vaccines as it pertains to the link to autism, and what were these studies, and were they safe to the point where it really reassured people?
So let's give Alison a chance to answer this, and then we'll maybe talk about a little bit more about that. But Alison, why don't you give a first, pass at answering some of these questions?
So the studies looking at vaccines and autism, which there are dozens and dozens, we have studies looking at MMR, as Nancy said, in relation to autism. And those studies showed that children who received MMR did not have a higher rate of autism. We have studies looking at thimerosal-containing vaccines and whether or not those children had a higher rate of autism diagnosis, and they did not. We also have studies looking at children who received vaccines according to the CDC schedule, children who received fewer vaccines than the CDC schedule, and also children who received no vaccines. And in those groups, we also do not see a difference in the rate of autism diagnosis. I think, though, the bigger issue is that we will never be able to do a study that shows that vaccines do not cause autism, because you can't do that kind of study. You cannot show that something does not cause something else. And so we're very much hampered by this language of having to say there's no association, or we don't see a causal relationship in the data. To me, the issue of people accepting the vaccine data is going to come down to whether or not we can actually give them information about what does cause autism. And moms have said that to me. They have said, you can't tell me vaccines don't cause autism until you can tell me what does cause autism. And so that's why it's so important, in my opinion, for the conversation to focus on what we have learned about the causes of autism. So I know you spoke earlier about the genetic causes, and an overwhelming amount of evidence points to genetics. In about 20 to 30% of kids, one genetic variant can explain their autism features. And in other cases, there are going to be multiple genetic mutations that are interacting to cause autism. We know that autism runs in families. We know that siblings of children with autism have a 15 times greater likelihood of being diagnosed than the general public. We also know that nieces and nephews of people with autism have a 3 times increased risk rate. So I think that we have to focus on examining how environmental factors work both independently and in conjunction with genes to cause autism. And we do know several of the environmental factors. I mean, I think it's important to point out that RFK is not the first person to say we need to look at the environment. We've been looking at the environment independently and in relation to genes. We know, for example, that being male, boys are diagnosed 4 times more frequently than girls. That's a risk factor. Being born prematurely. We know that children who are born early or children who are born with low birth weight have a higher probability of autism. I think you discussed earlier that having an older parent or two older parents at the time of conception, that adds to the likelihood of autism diagnosis. We know that illness during pregnancy can increase the likelihood that a child is going to be diagnosed with autism. So illnesses like rubella, pertussis. There's even some emerging evidence looking at COVID-19 and flu during pregnancy, which is why I was so really shocked yesterday when RFK announced that COVID vaccine would no longer be recommended for pregnant women, because we do have good emerging evidence that maternal immune activation or women who get sick during pregnancy, that is a risk factor. It's emerging evidence, but it's important to know.
Yeah.
That other exposures during pregnancy, like exposure to certain anti-epileptic drugs, high exposure to air pollution during pregnancy, gestational diabetes during pregnancy. So what we know from the genes that cause autism is that they cluster around prenatal development of synapses, but something is triggering them, and we need to focus on that prenatal period.
On some level, you applaud this search for environmental factors. I mean, that seems to be, if you look at RFK's language around this new initiative that he's kicked off, he's like, let's put the genetics aside and let's focus on environmental. Do you feel like there's an exclusion of genetics, or do you see this really as we've done a lot of groundwork on setting up sort of the genetics of this, and now there could be benefit here now to really go after these environmental factors?
So I think we've learned a lot from the genetics. We know that as I said, there are some single gene forms of autism that just having a deletion or duplication in that gene is enough to cause autism. But in most cases, it's genes interacting with the environment. I don't agree with RFK's stance that we should stop focusing on genetics and that there's one environmental toxin out there. I mean, we've had very smart scientists focused on this issue for 20, 25, 30 years now. If there were a single environmental toxin, I think we would have found it. So it's much more complicated than just saying, it's red food dye or it's this. It's going to be the interaction between genes and an environmental assault, likely one that takes place during prenatal development. And so that's where we need to double down our research.
Nancy, I've heard you say on our podcast that, sometimes you don't know where to get some information, or certain scientific information doesn't necessarily trickle down to you. We really appreciate you having, this perspective of a mom who's living the lived experience, but also now hearing from scientists and experts. How do you process all of that? For example, when, you hear RFK announcing this big push for, studying the non-genetic causes of autism, how do you bring all of it together? How do you synthesize it for the MAHA movement, for example?
Yeah, I would say that first of all, no matter who you follow, and I do follow RFK and a lot of what he represents, it doesn't mean that 100% of everything that comes out of his mouth I'm aligned with. But I do believe that he says a lot of good things, and some of it is what Alison is even featured, the environmental causes, the genes interacting with the environment should be very much at play. And if RFK is saying, let's take, and I don't know this per se, but if he's saying, let's take any research we've made, any dollars toward any genetic links toward this, and let's shelf it, I don't agree with that. Because I do agree, too, we need to proceed uncovering as much as we can about the genetic vulnerabilities. And so it's yes, and I think if there's an environmental trigger that needs to be looked at that potentially could interplay with the genes to deliver this condition, I think that, too, needs to be pursued. Like I have strong convictions about big corporations and what they'll do at any expense to keep things in play. And for example, a perfect example is glyphosate and how that's sprayed on 80% as an herbicide, world number one herbicide on our fruits and vegetables that everybody's exposed to. Depending on the study you look at, some call it a carcinogen, some call it a neurotoxic substance. How we can allow that for, just autism aside, how we can allow that for our Americans with such chronic disease, I don't know. But to me, if we could get an alternative herbicide or universal studies to confirm what this is doing to all of us, I would appreciate that.
So you mentioned, this herbicide, and does it potentially? I guess what your question is there such a corporate interest in using it that it's really out there everywhere, and it is possibly causing some autism?
I don't know that, but I think it should be explored as one environmental potential trigger. And what a lot of people don't understand too is it's being sprayed on all these fruits and vegetables or not, is the same thing that people are using on their lawns all over the place with Roundup.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I mean, it has been looked at a little bit, and I guess we're not able to go into each agent and each environmental toxin and give anybody really a yes or a no. Kind of like what Alison said about it's very hard to prove that something doesn't cause autism. But in terms of back just to the vaccines and that debate, because it's never going away. Are you okay, or how would you advise parents to proceed, especially if they're being diagnosed with autism, or especially if their child is up for a vaccine series, about should they get the vaccine? Should they not get the vaccines? What is the cause of autism? Is it linked to vaccines? Like, if you had to give a mom real world advice about what to do, what would you say to her?
It's so tough. I have to say, I believe in the efficacy and the reason we're doing preventing infectious disease. I believe in that. And I believe that vaccines are worthwhile. I just want them to be as safe as possible. So, but if I was pushed against a wall, Mark, today with a pregnant woman saying, tell me what to do, I would probably tell her to do what I did with my youngest son after my second son was diagnosed, which is I worked with a pediatrician who understood my concerns and vulnerabilities, and unknowing if this could be some factor in given our genetic vulnerabilities. And with my youngest son, we ended up doing a very delayed schedule. He did get his vaccines, but it wasn't. I still wonder, could there be studies done since we started doing 3, 4, 5 at a time? Because that compounds all the ingredients that you're giving this infant. So in my youngest son's case, I worked with my pediatrician to spread it out one at a time, and it took a longer time. And some people don't have that ability. If their child's in daycare and exposed to things, they don't. My son was at home most of that time. So, but if given that option, if I had to consult with somebody today, that's what I would say.
Just want to add to that. I understand why parents get scared of vaccines. I mean, think of vaccination. It's an overtly hostile act, right? You have to hold the kid down, they cry, you're injecting them with something that's in a vial. No one looks forward to having their child vaccinated. And I think 20 years ago, when children were getting more and more vaccines and the rate of autism was increasing, we were absolutely right to say we have to study whether vaccines could be a cause of autism. I think we have to now accept that those studies are done, and done and done and done. It's not an issue of we only have a handful of studies. We have dozens and dozens of studies, and they're not some show one thing and some show another, and some more work needs to be done. These studies are very clear. So my advice to parents would be to follow the science. Read the science. We have all of the vaccine studies on our website at the Autism Science Foundation, on a page called Read the Science for Yourself. And we encourage families to read the science for themselves, because we think that seeing that evidence will help parents to make the choice not to withhold vaccines from their children. What we've learned is that withholding vaccines does not decrease your child's risk for autism, but it absolutely increases the risk that they could contract and die from a vaccine preventable disease.
Yeah, it's interesting. RFK gives that same advice. I heard him, I think it was on maybe Dr. Phil interview we polled. He said, you research the baby stroller, you research the foods that you're getting, and you need to research the medicines that your children, are taking as well. But I do want to read one more quote, Allison. I just want you to help us unpack it. He said, we have to recognize that we are doing this to our children, and we need to put an end to it. And he was talking about autism. And I think he's talking societally, like it could be pollutions, it could be this, it could be that. But like, what do you hear when you hear that quote?
I mean, I agree. The whole foundation of the Autism Science Foundation is to fund studies to find the causes of autism and to develop medical interventions to remedy those causes. We want cures for autism. The issue, though, is that at the Autism Science Foundation, we are focused on evidence. I think sometimes he looks at existing studies, and if they don't confirm his belief, he dismisses them. And so that leads you to repeat studies that have already been done, like more vaccine studies, when really we need to look in new places if we want to find the causes of autism. Vaccines are probably the best studied potential environmental cause of autism, and those studies are done and they're conclusive. And I think we can't be so guided by our anger and our hurt about having a child with autism that we refuse to read what the data clearly show. Like, as I said, before we had those data, I agreed we needed to study vaccines in relation to autism. And back at that time, I might have shared Nancy's advice to families saying, we don't know yet, so maybe separate the shots. But now we do. And that's what's changed. Now we have that evidence. We have to act based on science and evidence.
Allison, if I'm hearing you, you're saying that if we studied everything about environmental toxins to the degree that we've studied vaccines, we'd be in a much better position. I mean, it's that well studied.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for studies of the environment and studies of how the environment interacts with genes. What I'm not for is spending more money when, there's not a bottomless pit of money at the NIH or the CDC where we can just study as many things as we want. Choices have to be made. And to me, the logical and appropriate choice is to study new potential environmental causes and conduct new studies on how environmental exposures interact with what we have learned in the last 5 years about the genetic causes. That's the cutting edge of research. And my concern is not just that we'll waste money on more vaccine studies, but that research is being cut across the board at the NIH, that those studies that are yielding fruit are being halted.
I wonder, Allison, in speaking with folks from Make America Healthy Again community, with Nancy, and also just folks, I think, who are maybe just feeling a little bit just let down by the medical establishment these days. One of the things that it sometimes feels like when you hear something like, the diagnoses metrics have gotten better and it's genetic, I think that can sometimes present as like, and therefore there's nothing you can do about it. Right.
Well, we know that's not true. I mean, and you can't open the newspaper or turn on the news without hearing about how CRISPR technology and gene editing is a reality.
So that's what I'd love to help someone who, when they hear that, right? And I think Kennedy is speaking to that community of people who are like, if it's just genetic and if all you're saying is really that we're just getting better at seeing people with autism, how does this incentivize the medical community to keep fighting autism and to keep fighting for moms like Nancy, like Allison, to make sure that we can provide a better future for our children? How do you make that case that fight is very much underway?
Genetic cause doesn't mean that there's no remedy. Just like genetic cause doesn't mean it's the parent's fault. I hear that from some parents as well, that if we say it's genetic, then it's their fault, which couldn't be further from the truth. I think what we're changing based on the genetic knowledge that we've developed over the last few years is that rather than just studying children with autism, where some had no language and some had abundance of language, some had IQ under 50 and some had genius IQ of 150. Some had self-injurious behaviors, and some children had social struggles navigating the middle school cafeteria. Instead of just sort of saying, well, autism is heterogeneous. Now, when we do studies, we group children into homogeneous groups based on the genetic cause. And we're seeing much more fruitful clinical trials of medications based on this gene first approach. We've seen very good progress with several of the subtypes of autism, including Angelman syndrome, Fragile X, Phelan-McDermott syndrome. So that's where I feel there's the most potential for us to study those monogenic forms of autism. And then also we recognize that even though not all children, we haven't found the gene in all children, or a gene in all children, what we're learning about the genes in the monogenic forms of autism is we're learning what their function is. What proteins are they responsible for turning on and off? Where do they influence brain development during the prenatal period? And how can we use that information to intervene in children who don't have genetic forms of autism, either upstream or downstream, to improve those children's lives as well? There's so much that we're able to learn from the new science that, like I said, sounded like science fiction a few years ago. And we're using these now to really understand the origins of how the brain develops from conception. It's just, to me, this is such a critical time in our understanding of autism science. And that's where we need to be investing. We need to understand, really early biological markers of autism, either before birth or right after birth, so that children can start early intervention. And I know you were talking about diagnosis using eye tracking at 16 months, but some papers are showing that we can use eye tracking to diagnose children as early as 6 weeks. And that is well before any behavioral symptoms are apparent. It means that we can start to intervene when children are infants and maybe prevent the most deleterious aspects of autism from even emerging in the first place. We have to do a better job of understanding how to use new technology to both diagnose autism, like eye tracking and other types of early AI-based diagnosis tools, but also understand how we can use like wearable devices, like we all wear on our wrist now, so no stigma, but understand how we can use those wearables and AI to predict self-injury, to predict seizures. That is, in my opinion, that's going to have an immediate and very high impact in improving someone's life at the point of care. So when we talk about, real world value of science, this is where we need to be spending our limited research dollars.
Nancy, when you hear Alison talk about all these innovations and forward looking on research, and does this excite you? Is there still something missing for you? Is all of this sort of like, I just don't buy it? Like, I'm just curious as to how you're hearing all this.
Yeah. I would say that I want to improve the life of people that are autistic, and to the degree that science and AI and everything else helps life become a little bit better because of it, I think is good. But when I hear, from that recent CDC reveal, I think in the state of California, it's 1 in 12 and a half boys now, my heart goes to prevention more, even though I have a son that needs a lot of help. It goes to how can we, and I know she's pointing to the genetics, and I think we need to do that. But to me, it's a balance of what is happening to these kids, and how do we identify them and try to prevent this more than deal after the fact. When I hear about the trillions of dollars this is going to cost our healthcare system, just with the number of newly diagnosed people every year, I don't know that everybody is awake to that this is going to shut down so many people that can't work. My son can't work. The economy will be impacted. Caregivers many times can't work. And then the healthcare costs themselves. So This to me is still a very much a crisis that needs to be solved in dollars spent toward uncovering the root cause. So that's just my thoughts for the moment.
I 100% agree. I think we need to focus on prevention. And I think that's what we're doing when we look at genetics, when we look at environment, when we look at gene environment interaction. That's what the Autism Science Foundation is all about, understanding the biological causes of autism and then developing interventions that remedy those medical causes. I think we have to, though, also keep in mind that the new CDC number, 1 in 31, that represents the broad spectrum of autism, including the vast majority of people in that 1 in 31 are higher functioning people with autism, and that a very large amount of the increase in prevalence since the DSM was changed in 2013 is due to the broadening of our diagnostic criteria. If you look at the prevalence of profound autism over that time, it has remained relatively steady at around 1 in 215. It's gone up slightly, but not nearly at the rate of the increase in prevalence of autism spectrum disorder overall. And when I talk about prevention and when I talk about cure, I'm focused on that 27% of people with profound autism. That is the community that wants prevention. That's the community that wants cure, as opposed to the broader community of neurodiversity advocates or self-advocates who are really not interested in science per se, who don't want to be cured, who believe that all of our research dollars, well, if research should be funded at all, they think that research should be focused on ways to improve employment opportunities for high-functioning people with autism, or what type of lighting is best in an employment situation. What are the best practices for getting competitive employment? That's not where I'm focused. I'm focused on children and adults with profound autism. Sometimes I think when RFK is talking about autism, it's clear from how he's describing it that he means profound autism, but he's including in his prevalence number everyone with autism spectrum disorder.
That's a good clarity point, Allison. That is a good clarity point. I would challenge, I think my son would probably be more in the moderate category, and he will be living with 24/7 care even in that category. So I don't see this as just a profound autistic issue. I think it's much bigger than that. And I think where we could just, at this moment, as this is ending, kind of agree to possibly disagree, is that as many studies that have been done on the possible correlation, and you say there's mounds and mounds and it's all on your website, I still don't have trust that they were done in the best way, all of them, and that enough was done across every vaccine and all the potential adjuvants, preservatives, and things that could be disrupting genes, could be disrupting the outcome. So we can't dive deeper into that right now. I understand that. But I think that's a point where we differ. And that's a point where this show is about, why should I trust you? And I just happen to say that I think in RFK's 40 years of litigation on the environment, I trust that he knows how to read science. He doesn't have to be a doctor. I trust that he can read science and has read science. And in my mind, if I trust that he can do this, and he's saying there's more studies that need to be done, I'm behind that. And that's my perspective.
Nancy, I think you're saying something that we have been hearing from folks, which is that when that trust piece is missing, Alison, and I'm sure you've seen this in your work, it's like the phrase, well, there have been so many studies done and it's settled. It is not settled for this community, right? And part of that is because they don't trust the ones who are saying it's settled. And so what I'm finding is that in this moment, that work of building trust where it's earned is really so paramount right now, that if folks really feel like there is this science that is saying this, rather than just get frustrated, and I'm not speaking to anyone in particular, but just rather than just get frustrated that I don't understand why we have to keep talking about this, it's settled. Clearly for like we're in a moment where we need to talk about it, that it's still something that is it's not accepted by folks, and to continue to say, well, you just have to accept it, feels like that's just not a path that is working. And so I don't know what the answer is. I truly don't.
I think what we're saying is that we recognize that we recognize those are very real concerns and fears that we won't be able to adequately address until we have an answer to the question of what does cause autism. I really think that's the key, that we'll never be able to say, we'll never be able to convince every mom that vaccines don't cause autism until we can offer that mom information about what does. And so that's why I feel so strongly that we need to direct our research spending at what's emerging as the most likely causes
right, it's
of
almost
autism.
like you don't even talk about, like, for you, the vaccines conversation is a distraction from the sort of exciting and burgeoning research that is coming out that is actually lending some real signals out there about what does cause autism, and that this in fact should be something to unite with people all over the country around whose families currently live with autism. Tom,
Yeah, I mean,
you had something.
Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just one foundational question and final question for you, Allison, is you have a mom here. You have Nancy. You have other moms listening. They don't feel trustful right now. Why? Just if you speak to them, you have your finger on the pulse of research right now. And you're saying there's exciting things going on here, and this is what we know, and this is what we don't know. And it was hard-fought battles in science for the last several decades. Why should they trust you?
When you look back over 20 years, we've invested a lot of time and energy, and it does feel like we have not made a meaningful difference either at the point of care or in our understanding of the actual causes. I think 20 years ago, we thought, I was told, we would find the gene or a handful of genes that cause autism in 5 to 10 years, and we would have targeted interventions. That didn't happen. So I think I understand why families have become mistrustful. Two things that I'm trying to get across. One is that I feel that has changed a lot in the last 5 years, where we have started to make really meaningful inroads at understanding the genetic and biological causes of autism. But I also I understand being a mom, and I just want to make sure that I leave everyone with the understanding that I understand where those moms are coming from. They love their children. And when you love your child so much, it's very natural to want to blame someone or something for the fact that your child is going to suffer and have all these challenges their whole life. I get that. I lived that. But I think really the key is to not let your anger and your hurt become so consuming that you become immune to what the science is clearly saying. And that's really the advice that I would leave for parents. I understand that hurt. I understand that anger. But if we really want to do what's best for our children, we need to accept what the science is showing, and accept that the science was done by scientists who are themselves parents, in many cases, parents of children with autism, who also are hurt and also are angry and also want to find the cause so that they can develop treatments.
Nancy, final thoughts.
Yeah, I just think we have work to do. I think we have work to do. I would be so fine if we found the root cause to this disorder. I would be so fine to say, whew, thank God it really wasn't autism, or it wasn't vaccines, and it wasn't glyphosate. It was this. I welcome that day. I really do. But
And I can say, I wish it was vaccines. I honestly wish that 20 years ago, those studies showed that vaccines did cause autism, because we could have acted on that, and we wouldn't be where we were today. So, I think it's sort of important to end on this note that in many cases we agree. You said earlier, Nancy, that just because you are a MAHA mom doesn't mean you agree with everything RFK says. And I just want to make it clear that just because I believe in genetics and I'm more focused on the science, that doesn't mean I disagree with everything that RFK says. I think at the end of the day, we're both moms. We both love our children. All of us as autism parents do this because we care deeply about our children and everyone else's children. And I know we talk a lot about areas where we disagree, but I think we agree in more areas than we disagree.
Agree.
Okay, so I am getting so many ideas out of this podcast. There's just so many opportunities. I think you're right, Nancy, of doing work, but doing work in a way that I think could be really powerful and constructive. And I'm going to sidebar with both of you to just talk about that. As you know, I like to bring groups together to talk some stuff out. So maybe this is one area that we can do some of that in. I really just want to thank our guests so much. Nancy Fuller from, she's a MAHA mom from Ohio, and Alison Singer, who is the founder and president of the Autism Science Foundation, both moms to really special kids. And we're really, this was a conversation that we've been wanting to have. And like you've seen, it can be tough at times, but I think that's why it's worth having, because it can get really messy out there sometimes when we're talking about it. So I'm just really grateful that everyone was on board. Thank you everyone for listening. Please send us questions or comments at questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. I didn't curse that much on this episode. I hope y'all recognize that. You're welcome. I'm Brenda Dakari. He's Tom Johnson. She's Maggie Bartlett. He's Dr. Mark. And we'll see you back here next week.